Hey, welcome to Dan's Model Works. And it's new project day. Yay! So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be building, or we're going to start building, a pair of Wessex helicopters. Let's see what we have here. We've got a pair of Wessex helicopter models. The Revell kit, which is a later kit, is actually the earlier version of the helicopter. It is an HAS3 and it had a Napier Gazelle turbine engine in it. And the Matchbox model is a HUS or HU5, and it had a coupled de Havilland later Rolls-Royce Gnome engine, which was a licensed version of the American T58 turbine. For those who are thinking this helicopter looks vaguely familiar, who aren't, helicopter aficionados, both of these helicopters are license-built copies of the American H-34, otherwise known as the Sikorsky S-58. So basically, in 1958, Westland had imported a example of the S-58 and had purchased a license to produce it. And after doing some testing, they decided to convert it over to turbine engine powered. Its first flight was in 1958 and it went into service in 1961, initially with the Royal Navy, later on with the RAF. And the RAF preferred the later version with the coupled engines. And basically, this had two Gnome engines side by side in the nose. And the idea was if one failed, the other one would spool up to full power and they would still be able to carry on flying. So what I want to do here is I want to build both of these at the same time. We'll look at a few comparisons. This is a much newer kit. This actually was tooled by Italeri, and it's one of the cooperative projects between Revell and Italeri, where basically Italeri would do the tooling and Revell would market it under their own name. And, well, they actually both would market it, but they would do different versions of it. I've built the Italeri H34 version of this, and I've got it somewhere. I'll bring it over in a second. Here's a completed version of Italeri's H34, and the main difference visually between the Wessex and the Choctaw or the Seahorse, depending on what version it was, is mostly the nose. The American version with the piston engine has a very blunt, rounded nose, and the nose on the Wessex is longer, and it has various air inlet arrangements on them. And it's longer basically because what they've done is they've mounted the turbine engines farther forward, because the turbine engines were quite a bit lighter than the piston engines. So mounting them forward enabled them to maintain the center of gravity for balance purposes without having to add any ballast or anything like that. Let's start by taking a look at the Matchbox Kit. I'm not sure what year the Matchbox Kit came out. I will try to look it up and flash it on the screen. With any sort of luck, that's flashing in a moment. So it comes in one of these wretched end-opening boxes, but then so does the Revell kit. There's our canopy and our windows, and a little thick on the transparencies, but nothing too horrible. We've got the decals, and this has some RAF and some Royal Australian Navy decals here. You can see by the kangaroo. Anyone who has built a kit that was tooled by Matchbox, and there are a lot of their kits that are still available through Revell since they bought the tooling, will recognize these very squarish rhomboid kind of sprues. Instead of them being a round cross section, they're squarish. So here is our nose right there. And this is the air inlet, I believe. Could be wrong. That'll fit onto there. And they actually give us the turbines, which is kind of interesting. So I'm not sure if that's going to be visible through the air inlet or not, but if it is, it'll be kind of cool. Here's the tail. This is probably the interior of the floor. Look at the instructions in a moment. And of course, another feature of Matchbox kits is molded in 3 or 4 colors. Ooh, as if you weren't going to paint it. There's our rotor blades, tail rotor. This is probably the cockpit floor. And then the last sprue, we've got our basic fuselage here. And as you can see, the rotor pylon gets added on top. And of course, here's the top, sorry. The rotor pylon gets added onto the top, and then the cockpit kind of gets scabbed on there. So, this is the air inlet part here. So no, that will not be see-through. Although I don't imagine it was on the real thing. And looking at the instructions here, we've got the regular potted histories, and we've got some legalese. Please don't eat the parts. And as usual with Matchbox, they kind of fold out. Matchbox instructions always look very, very busy. This is interesting, and I believe it's saying you're supposed to be removing this part for the Australian version. Interesting. And then if we look down here, you can see there's a whole new nose being grafted on. So, I'm thinking that there must be another version of this kit that does not have the same nose. So that was a quick overview of the Matchbox parts. And let's keep in mind that this kit was probably, when I purchased it, was probably a good 30 years old. Now let's take a look at the Revell offering. And like I said, this kit was tooled by Italeri. Here's our clear sprue. The windows aren't quite as bulged as much. And I think probably the detail on this is a little finer, but I don't think there's a huge amount to be given up between the two kits. If we look at this sprue here, you can see there's a giant gap here. So what Italeri will often do when they design a kit is they'll leave blank areas that in other versions of the kit there'll be a gate they can open up, and they can mold other parts in here, and then other things will be blind. And here is the alternate nose. And my H34 kit, of course, is put together, but I do remember that it had actually 3 nose doors. There was an alternate version for one side, depending, I believe, on whether it was the high stack or the low stack exhaust. So there's our transmission cooling part that goes here. And as you can see, the rotor pylon in the cockpit is actually molded into the top of the fuselage here. And the other sprue, because there is only 2 main sprues, we've got the rest of the body, the other side of the fuselage. We've got the rotor blades there. This is the underside. But otherwise, what I'm looking at here is very much what I remember from the H34 kit. Here we've got the decals. Very nicely printed. Nothing out of the ordinary from what you'd expect from Revell or from Italeri. And their instructions have got the potted history in English and German, now that I bothered to read it. And it has the normal legalese. Please don't eat the parts. It's got a sprue map. Pretty much what we expect in this day and age. And there's nothing surprising here or anything like that. Now, visually, there is a difference between the Napier-powered Wessex and the Gnome-powered Wessex. And this I've always felt was just a little bit amusing, actually, in that the Gazelle was a single turbo shaft, and it had 4 outlets coming off the back of the engine, 2 coming out on either side of the helicopter. And that was basically the same engine that was used in the Belvedere. And it looks like the air intake is right here. It's kind of this extra flap, so the air is sucked from below in, and then, of course, out. And I wonder, probably they felt this was not a big problem on a helicopter that was going to be operating at sea, because you're not talking a lot of dust. But there was a similar arrangement in the Belvedere where essentially, the engines were sucking their inlet air from underneath the helicopter, which strike you as being a very dusty location. If we switch to the later, you can see they've moved the air inlet to the top of the nose, which makes a whole lot more sense for a helicopter that's operating in dusty environments, because you're sucking the air from up here versus down here. But I've always thought the funny part of the Wessex with the Gnome engines is it has 2 enormous exhaust pipes, one on each side, that almost seem to be pointed at the door for the passengers to be jumping in and out of. Now, I'm sure the temperature is not brutal coming out of there, but I always thought, if they wanted to heat up some food, maybe do up a hot dog or something like that, you could just put it on a stick and warm it over the engine outlet. Although if the pilot had his window open, you could probably stay warm from this. I don't know. Anyway, that was a look at the 2 kits. I'm going to try to build these in parallel, and we can look at some of the differences and compare how much kit technology has progressed in the 30 years or so since Matchbox did its offering to Italeri and Revell doing theirs. Even this, I believe, is about 10 years old at least. So we're here at the clutter zone. I'd just like to clarify something about the parts in the Matchbox kit. You can actually create both the Napier Gazelle powered Wessex and the Gnome powered Wessex with this. The main reason I got the kit was because I wanted to be able to do the Gnome version. And the way it works out is if you're doing the Gnome version, you're not going to be cutting off the nose from the fuselage. You can see this semicircular shape here. Well, it's actually, half of a circle. That is where those big exhausts that look kind of like a warthog tusk, they come out right there. And if we look at this other part with the alternate nose, you can see here's the 4 smaller locations where the exhausts from the Gazelle exhaust come out. This nose piece goes on this nose, and I believe this nose piece here goes on the later version with the Gnome engine, and this is the one we're going to be building this kit as. And the Revell / Italeri kit, it's going to be used to build the earlier version that had the Gazelle engine in it. I'm sure this is going to be the first of many comparison photos. Here we have the Matchbox cockpit on the left, and the Italeri Revell one on the right here. And of course, as you can see, as normal, I've managed to lose a part. That's one of the foot pedals for the tail rotor control. Now, let's just tilt this back a little bit here. You can see there's definitely a whole lot more detail engraved into the Revell Italeri part, but really the Matchbox one, for when it was made, which I believe was the early 80s, mid 80s, something like that, isn't too bad. The Instruments between them are pretty good. What you will notice is that between the seats there's an instrument panel there. On the Matchbox it's just basically plain, and of course there's no seat belts or anything like that on the seats. Plus the detail on the side of the seats of the Italeri one is pretty amazing. On the other hand, the Italeri cockpit, the rudder pedals are just basically triangles molded into the floor, whereas Matchbox at least tried to give us something a little bit more interesting. As I try to focus, you can see there's a little bit more of a distinct shape there. We'll see what they look like after I get them painted up. Now it's a couple days later. I haven't been working on these continuously, but you can see I've painted them up. And the Matchbox one here, you can see that I've just dry brushed the instruments and the controls between them there. The Italeri / Revell one here, they give you a decal for the center console. For the back console, they don't give you one, so that's just been dry brushed. Yeah, there's a whole lot more detail with the Italeri Revell one. Although, in some respects, I like what Matchbox did with its rudder pedals versus what Italeri did. Of course, the seats are a whole lot more detailed here. And not only that, they represent what the seats really do. See, the seat bottoms flip up so that the pilot and co-pilot can go between the passenger / cargo compartment up into the cockpit. Whereas the Matchbox one, the seats are just basically solid objects glued in place. So none of that's represented. Now, I probably could have scratch built a bunch of stuff in the Revell or in the Matchbox one to make it closer to this. I don't think it's really worth the effort. If there was nothing in here, or if it was really terribly primitive, I might have. But really, for the 1980s, which I believe is when the tooling was cut for this, it's not too bad. And I think I'm just going to let it stand on its own. Now, here is the instrument panels. Let's get a good focus on them here. The top one is the Matchbox, and the bottom one is the Revell Italeri one. Now, I know Revell was responsible for the decals, and I think they've really dropped the ball here in that the decal looks like it's about only about 80% of the size it should be, and it doesn't come anywhere near filling that entire space. Meanwhile, Italeri went and molded in all kinds of bumps and dials and things like that go almost out to the edges. So, I'm almost preferring the Matchbox offering here over what Revell has done with this decal. I mean, it's really undersized. Now, you know what? We're never going to see it. Once we get the cockpit all together, we're never going to see that. But it's put together anyway. As I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to give you some comparisons between the two as we go. So I've started assembling the main interior compartments here. And you can see there is a difference in the way that they've gone about it. Italeri has given us the front and rear bulkheads. And Matchbox gives us the front bulkhead, but not the rearmost one. And there's pretty much no detail in here at all. It's just smooth, and you can see we have a very large ejector pin mark here. Although if we look at the Italeri interior, you can see there's some doozies of ejector pin marks as well. The interesting thing is at least Italeri gives us some basic interior framing. What's missing from both kits is any sort of representation of the sonar gear. And that's a little bit of a disappointment. Now, the H34 version of this kit does at least give us troop seats to put on the sides. whereas this one is nothing. There's nothing there at all. So I'm definitely going to be having the hatches closed. Now, this later version of the Wessex, it was still Royal Navy, but I believe it was basically a troop carrying helicopter for the Royal Marines. So you could get away with saying, well, they didn't have the sonar equipment on board. But the earlier version with the Australian decals was a sub hunter, and you'd think that it would have been nice if either one of the manufacturers had given us just a basic setup of the equipment with the sonar operating station and the chairs and the consoles and things like that, but they did not. So I'm not going to be making any effort to having the doors open. So I've got my fuselage glass in place here, and I'm just test fitting these, and the Revell Italy one goes together really, really well. I'm not foreseeing any sort of fit issues here at all, and I knew that from building the H34 a few years ago. This is going to go very well. Although I have to say, neither one of these kits to the fuselage are parts to go together nearly anywhere as well as that Hobby Boss MI4 Hound kit. That kit, and there should be a link up here somewhere, that went together like Lego. Things just simply clicked together. But no real fit issues with the Italy one. The Matchbox one, as befitting an older kit, does look like there's going to be a little bit of a struggle. The top isn't too bad. Looks like things should go together all right. A little bit of a fight on the underside. One thing that's kind of curious here, though, is let's zoom in and hopefully get a focus. There. You can see that Matchbox gives us a pin on both sides of the fuselage to go together. Really? Excuse me? Although the pins don't actually line up, but there's no actual holes on the other side of the fuselage for those pins to go on. So I'm not quite sure if the guy who did the tooling on this side of the fuselage talked to the guy who did the tooling on the other side, but they both have pins, which is a little curious. Not that there's anything wrong with that. As can be seen in this shot, both of the models require some clamping and clothespins in order to achieve a good bond of the fuselage halves. The Italy Revell offering didn't require a lot of force, just basically clamp it so it gets a good bond. The Matchbox one had to start at probably the spot in which it fit the poorest and then worked my way along the fuselage. The clamps and the clothespins are off, and the Italy Revell version was fairly pain-free. It'd be even better if I didn't drop it. The Matchbox offering ended up needing substantial clamping, especially up here, and this is going to require a lot of sanding, a little bit of filling to clean up that joint, but there's not a lot of panel lines up there, so I don't think that's going to be the end of the world. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to is this part here, which we're never going to see once it gets put together. It gets completely hidden. But the reason I want to call your attention to it is, of course, you can see the front of two turbine engines, and that illustrates the setup that was in the Gnome-powered version of the Wessex. And basically we had two turbines that were mounted nose down, exhausting here, and then there was a combiner gearbox that basically its drive shaft went up the same way as the original piston engine to the transmission here. In the Napier powered one, well, I don't have the nose on, but basically it had a single turbine mounted in here, basically nose down as well. And this gave the helicopters a far better power to weight ratio, which is why the British military and aviation industry went with them. And it was something that the Americans would eventually do as well with its next generation of helicopters. Now, there was an American turbine-powered version of the S-58, and that was the S-58T, but it was never put into production. Basically, it was a kit that customers could buy, and then they could convert their helicopter over. And this is all we're going to do this episode on our Pair of Wessex project. And thanks for watching, and until next time, just keep on modeling.